Hey everyone, this is Nurai Yurt from Peace Islands Institute. I'm the board president for the last 3 years for Peace Islands. As you know, Peace Islands' vision and mission is really connecting people, intellectuals to the people. So with the new video conference chances we have, right now we have a remote speaker that we're so happy to have on our line today, Tim Crane. And I think we're going to really hear from her, from his expertise, from his background. He will have a presentation for us, and I'm going to try to get some questions in. And we're looking forward to hearing your questions as well through our channel, so that we can learn, continue to learn from him outside of his presentation as well. So I just want to give a background about Tim Crane. He's a historian, professor, and an administrator. His area of specialization is comparative religious history, modern European history, and the Middle East. Mr. Crane is the former director of the National Catholic Center for the Holocaust Education, and he has previously taught at the University of Wisconsin and Marquette University. He's a recipient of numerous teaching and administrative awards, and in 2015, he received Marquette University's National Alumni Award for Leadership Excellence. So we're so happy to have him. Thank you so much, Tim. I'm going to call you. And we're looking forward to learning from you within your expertise. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Tim. So
thank you very much. So should I begin? It's good to see you.
Definitely.
Okay, sounds good. So just present.
Well, actually, you have to share the screen first.
What's this?
No worries. Awesome. We can see the screen now, so this is great.
Okay.
And if you want to go to this is, I think, awesome. Perfect full screen. This is pretty good.
Is that good?
Perfect. I think we can kick it off. I mean, I think our subject today is super interesting. It's the common bonds of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So we look forward to hearing from you.
Okay. Very good. Well, I thank you all for being here this afternoon. Hope all is well out in the East. I'm in the Midwest, in the Milwaukee area in Wisconsin. And what I'd like to do over the course of probably about roughly 30 minutes or so is to give a little bit of background information, hopefully to generate some questions, looking at the three historic faiths, the Abrahamic faith. Back when I was with the University of Wisconsin, we were looking to generate more and more interest in the Center for Jewish Studies. And we reached out in terms of Christianity. So we have Judaism and Christianity, common bonds, etc., as well as looking at historical background of Moses and Jesus. Well, then we transitioned that as well in terms of trying to generate more students for our program from Judaism, Christianity to Judaism, Christianity, Islam, three religions but one God. We were going to call it the Abrahamic faith, but then we figured the students would know what we meant by Abrahamic faiths and we wouldn't get much of a turnout for it. So we decided this to spell everything out. But to formally begin, in the world in the present day, we have about 7.3 billion people. And of the three Abrahamic faiths, the one thing, of course, that they all have in common, that each religion has in common, we all trace our ancestry back to the great patriarch of Abraham. He's in essence, as oftentimes referred to, Abraham as this interfaith superstar. And in the world today, you have, with 7.3 billion people, you have about 14 million Jews. You have 2.3 billion Christians and about 1.8 billion Muslims. So the population, especially in terms of the sister faiths of Christianity and Islam, are very, very large, very prominent here from a global perspective, whereas the first monotheistic faith that last, in fact, for centuries, the religious faith of Judaism remains, in fact, fairly small. Well, what I'd like to do is to focus more so, because over the course of human history, particularly when it comes to issues of religion, it's a situation that things tend to, the differences are exaggerated. And what I'd like to do here instead, over the time that we have together here this afternoon, is to look more so on the ties that bond, the ties that bind these three historic faiths together. Because if we look at this from the framework of going all the way back to the start here of monotheism, where it really starts to be solidified, back to this historic figure of Abraham from around 1900 before Common Era, we will see these striking parallels in the respective experiences. So in the course of 5,000 years of recorded history, polytheism, or the worship of more than one God, was the norm overwhelmingly. This was true going back to these ancient great civilizations, whether it was the Egyptian world or Greek civilization, which started becoming prominent around 800 before Common Era, or the Roman world, which started becoming prominent around 200 before Common Era. Polytheism ruled the roost, so to speak. But what set these Abrahamic faiths off is the fact that they were all going to transition, or they would in fact formally become monotheistic religions. This belief in one God and one God only. And we see this first with the origins of the religious faith of Judaism. Now, Judaism, the great gift, so to speak, of the Jews would be the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians would in fact refer to as the Old Testament, what Muslims would refer to as the book. And you have here in this Hebrew Bible, what sets the Jews, as they eventually become known as, apart, is that they are the first civilization to, in essence, have their own national history. Well, this isn't a history or a national history for the historian. Rather, what it is instead is it's a description of a covenant between God and his people, the Jewish people. And what you see also stepping forth from this is the foundation of a demand for an ethical conduct, the Ten Commandments. And this is very, very important in terms of solidifying the religious faith, because in the ancient world, it was a sense of, in terms of what do the gods or goddesses, depending on the civilization, what do they expect of us? We do not know. But from the framework here, it became crystal clear. We know exactly what God, what the supreme being demands of us. And he demands of us ethical conduct. So you see with this religion, it's Abraham who is going to, thousands of years ago, take a small group of followers away from the historic Mesopotamian lands, away from the historic city of Sumer. And eventually, as the centuries progress, the Hebrews, as they're more commonly known as, they're going to get too close to the Egyptian world, and Egyptian civilization will reach out and enslave them. And as the centuries progress, you have the emergence here of this historical figure who's very, very prominent in the three religions, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, this historic figure of Moses. And it will be Moses, of course, who is going to lead the Jewish people, or the Hebrews, the Israelites, as they also referred to themselves as, freeing them here from the bondage of slavery, leading them to freedom. And what we see with this historical figure of Moses, as well as the religious faith that will come forth of Judaism, will be cemented. What you see here is an individual that his life is going to be nicely compartmentalized into 40 years. My Jewish friends will say, oh, may you live the life of Moses. Moses lives to be 120. And you have his life nicely compartmentalized into 40 years, the first 40, the next 40, and then, of course, the final 40. And it will be Moses who will lead over the course of the third part of his 40 years. He will lead here the Israelites to freedom and their search, their quest for the promised land. Often this land here, which it would take a lot shorter amount of time in this ancient world. It's not exactly clear as to why the wanderings went on for 40 years before being able to approach the promised land. But nevertheless, it will be Moses who will lead here the Hebrews to the promised land, to a land that would be referred to as the centuries progress more commonly as Palestina, sometimes Judah, sometimes Judea, etc. Well, what happens is you have this people who will establish themselves here in this new area. And the problem is that for the Hebrews, eventually known as the Jews, they're very, very weak militarily. Politically, they're unsophisticated. It's not going to be an easy situation by any stretch of the imagination. And they're surrounded, perhaps more importantly, by civilizations that are far larger, far more prominent, far more militaristic than was the case here with the Hebrews. And in 722, the Assyrians, a very militaristic civilization, 722 before Common Era, will sack the northern kingdom here of this civilization, of the Hebrew civilization, the so-called 10 lost tribes. And all that's left is the southern part of the kingdom, Judah, with its capital city, the city of Jerusalem. Well, as the centuries progress, for this monotheistic peoples, it's not going to improve much, unfortunately. And they will be attacked. They will be attacked here yet again by the Babylonians. In 586, the temple, this one temple for the one God here of the Jews, is going to be destroyed. Thousands of Jews will be killed, as the residents of Judah referred to as. Tens of thousands more are going to be carried off into what becomes known to slavery, what becomes known as the Babylonian captivity. So the situation doesn't improve. Eventually, the Persians are going to sack the Babylonians, so the Jews can in fact formally come back here. But unfortunately, the situation does not improve either. For as the centuries progress, around 200 before Common Era, there emerges yet another very prominent civilization, arguably the most prominent civilization the world had known up until that time, the Romans. And around 200 before Common Era, the Romans and the historic boot of Italy begin to expand off into Southern Europe, as well as different parts of North Africa. And by the time here they reach Syria, they reach here as well as Palestina, as the Romans are going to refer to the land as. The slave population, as it has been a very, very, very aggressive civilization in terms of slaughter, in terms of slavery. They're the largest slave population the world had ever known. And what happens, the slave population is so large, they don't need any more slaves. But what they're going to do is keep a close eye here on these areas, as well as including historic Egypt. Well, from the standpoint here of any civilization that would try to rise up in open rebellion against the Romans, it was an exercise in futility. They would crush you. Very, very militaristic. But ironically enough, in 31 before Common Era, you have the Emperor Augustus Caesar, who is the heir apparent to his uncle Julius Caesar, defeating the combined forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium. And what this does, this victory for this civilization, the Roman world, that has controlled virtually the Middle East, North Africa, as well as all of Southern Europe, reducing the Mediterranean Sea to a Roman lake. Ironically, what is going to transition will be this time period known as the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana, or literally Roman peace in terms of translation. What this means is from 31 before Common Era, from the time of the Battle of Actium and the victory of Augustus Caesar, all the way through the end of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius in the year 180 in the Common Era. So for over 200 years, the Roman Empire is in fact going to be at peace and stability. Well, what happens is there's one exception. There's oftentimes, of course, in history, exceptions to every rule. And in this exception to the rule, what we find in essence is we find here the one exception is this land of Judea or Palestina. And here, the Jews, as far as they're concerned, as we're entering into the time period of about 10 before Common Era, as far as they're concerned, they wanted their independence. They wanted to be free here of Roman control. They didn't want to be controlled by the Romans any more than they wanted to be dominated, by the Assyrians or the Babylonians. And the Romans recognized this, and they had put in power here this Roman puppet king, Herod the Great, who's a Roman polytheist. And Herod the Great is going to go off on this process of beatifying the area, building bridges and roads. He's going to rebuild the temple that centuries before the Babylonians had destroyed, trying here to undermine this unhappiness, this thorn in the side, so to speak, for the Roman Empire. Well, there's different Jewish groups that emerge here at this stage. And these Jewish groups, as far as they're concerned, they're looking at this Roman domination in slightly different lights. They all agree they would like their independence. But the first major group, the Sadducees, the well-to-do residents here, these Jewish residents of this land, who they occupy for the most part, the city of Jerusalem. The Sadducees' attitude is the Romans have done a great deal of reforms. They've brought us roads and bridges. They've made Jerusalem the second most beautiful city in the entire empire, second only to Rome itself. And in this regard, we need to work within the framework for greater and greater reforms. We can't rise up in rebellion. That would be an exercise in stupidity. Second major group, the Essenes. The Essenes are contemplating the end of the world. They're looking here for this mystical union with God. They're often communes. The belief was off around the area of the Dead Sea. And they're really very, very apolitical. The Pharisees are the third major group. And from the standpoint of the Pharisees, what the Pharisees are anticipating is the coming of a Messiah, literal translation, anointed one. Now, this Messiah is going to be sent down from heaven, will be sent here down from heaven, and the Messiah is going to rescue, in essence, rescue the Jewish people from the control of the Romans. We will know it is a Messiah when he frees us from Roman domination. It is imperative to understand that in terms of the Pharisees, the writing of the Pharisees, there is nothing that talks about this individual, this Messiah, dying to save the world from original sin. It's far more political. It's far more militant comparatively. The fourth major group are the Zealots. And as far as this Jewish group is concerned, the only thing the Romans understand is the use of force. As Jews, we have to rise up in open rebellion and throw off this yoke of Roman oppression. It is in this tense political environment that Jesus of Nazareth is born. Now, Jesus of Nazareth could have been born as early as the year 4 before Common Era or as late as the year 1 in the Common Era, somewhere in that 5-year time frame. And in terms of his early life, he's a challenge for the historian. And for his early life, we know very, very little. He's living off in Nazareth, and it's difficult to determine really in essence what he is doing. He may have eventually been a follower of John the Baptist. That's a distinct possibility. But what happens here is at the age of 30, he begins his public ministry. And his public ministry lasts at least 1 year, perhaps as long as 3 years. It's difficult to discern. And it's a very rural movement. And he will preach in terms of the importance of love and forgiveness to these crowds. He will attract here Jewish followers. He will perform miracles as well over his public ministry. And he enters the city of Jerusalem, an area that he has been avoiding. And he enters the city of Jerusalem to celebrate, in essence, the Jewish feast of Passover. Well, what happens is the Romans, as far as they're concerned, they're keeping a close eye on this area, especially of Jerusalem, this hotbed of insurrection. And they have put in control here of these areas, especially around these holy days, these high holy days. They have put in control these Roman autocrats, these iron-fisted military commanders. And such is the case with Pontius Pilate. Well, what happens here is Jesus of Nazareth is going to be arrested as a rabble-rouser, as a troublemaker, and he will be executed in the classic Roman form of execution, death by crucifixion. Well, his Jewish followers, they're referred to as Nazarenes. And what they claim is that after 3 days of being dead, he rose from the dead. And he would visit with them here over the course of the next 40 days and then formally and effectively ascend into heaven. As far as the Nazarenes were concerned, this person was the Messiah, no doubt about it. And what happens in this new religious faith known as Christianity is it's not exactly sure if it's part of the Jewish tradition, if it's the end finished product of Judaism. It's not entirely clear. Well, what you have is the emergence of the second most important person in the history of Christianity, Saul of Tarsus, more commonly known as St. Paul. And St. Paul begins this missionary movement across the entire Roman Empire, going in essence to very, very urban areas across the board. And he will write all these letters, Paul to the Romans, Paul to Timothy, Paul to the Ephesians, Paul to, the list goes on and on. And as this tireless missionary, he is trying to expand this, not so much in the framework of Judaism, which early Christians see themselves certainly as operating in, but also here as sending this out to the Gentiles. It becomes this very large movement by comparison to convert the masses to this one perfection of faith as far as the Christians are concerned. And the foundation, adding to the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, will be this New Testament. The 4 Gospels will be included in this as well, that describe the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, along with these letters of Paul. Well, the goal, the hope, the objective was expansion here across the entire Roman Empire. To have this religion, this new religious faith of Christianity become the official faith. Well, it takes a good deal of time. And in the year 300 in the Roman Empire, literally almost 300 years following the end of the earthly existence of Jesus of Nazareth, only about 2% of the Roman Empire is in fact Christian. However, all of that will change in 312 with the Emperor Constantine. Constantine in 312 is going to formally announce his conversion following his victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. His mother was in fact an avowed Christian. And what happens here is suddenly now Christianity is not only going to become an official and a legal religion in the Roman Empire, it is also going to transition by leaps and bounds across the entire empire. By comparison, the sister faith of Judaism, following the Zealot uprisings in the 1st century in the Common Era, they would be effectively thrown out here of the historic Promised Land. And they begin in this period of what becomes known as diaspora, the scattering to different parts of the Middle East, as well as across the historic North African region of the Roman Empire, also into the Roman Empire, what eventually would become European civilization. Christianity is going to become the official religion of the Roman Empire. And even when the Roman Empire effectively falls in the year 476, it will continue to grow and prosper. Well, you have, in essence, our third religion looming on the horizon, our third Abrahamic faith, because just as Judaism will trace its ancestry all the way back to Abraham, so too would be the case with Christianity. So too would be the case, the great patriarch for Islam, the figure of Abraham as well. Well, here in this transition, in this transformation, we find the historical figure of Muhammad. Muhammad lived from 570 to 632. And he's an individual who is basically, he's orphaned at a very young age, born into the polytheistic world of the Arabian civilization at this time. And he's an orphan, as I just mentioned, and he'll be raised by his uncle Abu Talib. And his early life is relatively uneventful. He knows what it's like to be an outsider. He knows what it's like to be from the outside looking in. And in essence, he develops a tremendous sense of compassion for the other. And you have this individual who's working as a shepherd. He cannot read, he cannot write. And he goes to work here later, a little bit later in his life, as a field hand for a wealthy widow by the name of Khadijah. She's 10 years older than he is. The two of them fall in love and they get married. Now, this is very significant because for Muhammad, in essence, he really doesn't even have to work if he doesn't want to, but he decides to begin this life as a merchant. And what will happen with Muhammad is he will travel around in the years that follow. He and Khadijah will have a number of sons. None of them live past their early life. They will also have 4 daughters. And you have here a person who is going to learn a great deal about the religious faith of Judaism. He is also going to know, or he is also going to learn a great deal about Christianity. And from the perspective of Muhammad, there's really not a differentiation between the two, the people of the book. He sees these 2 religions as indeed being very, very similar. Well, his life is relatively uneventful, actually, in terms of his early life. At the age of 40, everything is going to change. And he is concerned about the materialism of Arabian civilization, and that there's all sorts of problems in terms of this looking for what is the real meaning of life, why are we all here in this journey. And at the year 610, he will experience this religious transformation where he is paid a visit from the angel Gabriel. And when Christians think of angels, they think of it as kind of like Christmas, and it's a sense of angels floating around, and it's very, very peaceful and harmonious, etc. This was not the situation in any way, shape, or form. It was a terrifying experience. And what you have is the angel Gabriel, assuming the body of a man, stressing that Muhammad, there is but one God, God, or Arabic for God, Allah. What this does is it leads to this transition for this person, and for the remainder of his life, he continues to receive here, continues to experience these visions, these recitations come forth, and they set the foundation for what becomes known as the Quran. Historians view the Quran as the most elegant book ever written. If read in its original Arabic, it has a flow very comparable to a Shakespearean sonnet. Well, what you have is the foundation of this 3rd Abrahamic faith. Just like Christianity sees itself as the finished product of Judaism, so too does Islam see itself as the finished product of the Judeo-Christian tradition. You have the 5 pillars, okay, as the foundation here of this monotheistic faith. And the public ministry of Muhammad is going to begin in Mecca. Eventually, he's going to take a small group of followers with him and flee north because there were too many people who were interested in his message. Medina is going to carry great significance because it will be the first city to formally convert to this new monotheistic faith. Mecca will, in fact, formally follow. Jerusalem is the most important city for Judaism. It is the most important city for Christianity. It becomes the 3rd most important city for the religious faith of Islam. Submission to the will of God. Because it will be, as is also in the Quran, that Muhammad will experience this night flight, this vision that will take him by winged horse to the city of Jerusalem. And it will be here near the Western Wall, the holiest of holy sites for Jews, as well as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a very holy site indeed for many Christians, that he will experience his own resurrection, his own triumph here as he will ascend into heaven. Well, you see this new religion of Islam that is indeed very, very comparable to its 2 sister faiths. Hence the term or the terminology of the Abrahamic faiths. And in the Quran, we have here these individuals from these historic figures from the Judeo-Christian Bible that are also very, very prominent. Khalil Allah, friend of God, okay? Abraham, the first mover. Kalim Allah, or communicator with God, that is Moses. Moses is very prominent in the Quran. Ruh Allah, or Spirit of God, Jesus. Muslims accept the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth right on through. In fact, they even add an extra miracle that Jesus had the gift of speech from the time of birth. From the perspective, however, of his death, of his execution, that's where we see the transition, the transformation, because as far as Muslims are concerned, there's no way that Allah would allow his only son to die such a terrible death. So of course you'd say in Christianity, well, it's the foundation of Christianity, but Jesus is very, very closely tied with this religious faith as well. Rasul Allah, or messenger of God, the historic figure Muhammad, the final prophet in a long line of prophets. And what we find here with this third monotheistic, this third Abrahamic faith, is a religion that, just like Christianity, is going to proselytize, is going to look towards expanding. And it will expand throughout the Middle East, first and foremost to what is present-day Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula, and even by the time of the end of the earthly existence of Muhammad in 632, he can see that this religion is going to be a success. It's going to make it. And the expansion continues. The expansion here as well continues across North Africa, okay, in different parts of the Middle East, across North Africa, into areas as well of the historic southern part of Europe. And what we find here with the caliphs, or the deputies of the prophet, as the expansion moves onwards, Islam is going to cover more territory in terms of moving into what is, for the most part, an overwhelmingly polytheistic area here of the Middle East and across parts of North Africa. We will see this transition, this transformation of covering more ground in 100 years than Christianity did in terms of territory in 300 years. Well, the religions are very, very similar. Obviously, there is also here some differences. And in terms of similarities and differences, first and foremost, how Islam and Judaism are comparable is the dietary restrictions. Okay? Very, very similar in terms of dietary restrictions. For example, pork is not consumed. It is in the framework of Christianity. Also, rabbis, clerics, they are on equal standing here with the respective congregation. Whereas in Christianity, whether you're talking ministers or priests, they're considered here a step above. That is not the case. It's also here, the comparable standing makes Islam and Judaism very, very similar. Islam and Christianity also have great similarities. First and foremost, the belief in angels, the belief here in angels. Okay? Second of all, belief in hell. Jews don't believe in hell. There's no concept here. Einstein would talk about it as well in the 20th century, saying this whole concept of God as this supreme being who rewards eternal life for those who please him, and for those who displease him, they're going to have eternal punishment, didn't make a lot of sense. Well, that would be a very, very Jewish thing, in essence, to say. It's more cut and clear from the standpoint of Christianity and Islam in terms of what happens to us at the end of our earthly existence. Islam and Christianity thus are similar in that regard. They're also similar in terms of this belief in the resurrection of the body. The relationship thus between these three faiths became a question of what was in fact going to follow. And unfortunately, one of the major issues, one of the major breaking off points became the Crusades. The Crusades with their origins in 1095. It is something that I would say in the relationship between Christianity and Islam in 2020, we're still trying to bridge. We're still in essence here trying to bridge. The Pope Urban II from Clermont, France, called for this crusade, this religious war, for the Christian soldiers to take away the birth of Christianity, take from the Muslim infidel here, the most important city of all in Christianity, the city of Jerusalem. And he raises here an army of over 100,000 crusaders. Well, before the Crusaders even set off from historic Europe, Jews, who represent about 1% of the population in Europe, they are going to be slaughtered by the thousands. Terrible scenes as the Crusaders move forward into Antioch in 1098, as well as Jerusalem 1099, as the Crusaders will succeed, but slaughtering here countless tens of thousands of Muslims throughout the area, throughout these lands, all the way to the ultimate destination, the city of Jerusalem. Well, what this does is it leads to a backlash, not surprising at all. And the Muslims are going to retaliate, and it's going to lead to further crusades. Finally, 1216, the issue will end with Islam still in control here of the Holy Land. Well, what it does is it really poisons the relationship. From that time onwards, Christianity and Islam tend to go their separate ways, have less to do with each other. By comparison, the sister faith of Judaism remains here. You have Jews in the historic Islamic lands, as well as Jews living in Christian Europe. And if you're Jewish, overwhelmingly, you were far better off living in the Islamic civilization, in the Islamic world, than you were living in Christian Europe. For what happens in Christian Europe is you have this Christian anti-Judaism that is going to continue. It reached homicidal proportions first and foremost in the time period of the Crusades. This whole attitude of the Jews as Christ killers, the Jews as ritual murderers, it would continue on as the Jews would be scapegoated, blamed for the Black Death. They're going to be persecuted as well at the time of the Spanish Inquisition. Virtually, they would be demonized, this population, by a population or by the sister religion of Christianity, a religion that should have been, in fact, its greatest protector. Well, the net result here is that you have, in essence, a very, very difficult relationship between these three religions. And it continues onwards as the centuries move on. But what's imperative to understand is the ties here that, in fact, bind these three religions are far, far more important than the differences. And in the present day, and what gives me a great deal of hope, is that in the present day, you have this commonality, or the way it is described in the United States, Judeo-Christian, Judeo-Christian, Judeo-Christian. And that's good. That's very good. It's a step in the right direction. Yet by the same token, as a historian and as an American, the third Abrahamic faith, Islam, belongs here with its two sisters. For at the end of the day, if there's but one thing as an eternal truth, there is but one race, the human race. And unfortunately, over the course of thousands of years of history, there's been too much of a demonization, an exaggeration of our differences, and too little of an outlook of the ties that bring us all together in this journey of life and beyond. Thank you. So let's see here.
Thank you so much, Tim. We really appreciate. There's a lot of great information here. So I have one question coming from our audience, and I will, start with that. And as the questions come in, I will go back and forth with my questions and the audience's questions. And I mean, we know Moses and Jesus are still super important figures in Islam, and they're believed to be the messenger still, within the Islamic tradition. How is Muhammad is seen within the Judaism and Christianity traditions, especially as you explained within the historical context?
How are they seen?
How is he
Islam
seen?
viewed by Jews?
Muhammad is seen by Jews and Christians, like as the figure.
I would think I would say that basically it's viewed. Muhammad is viewed in terms of a continuation, like of monotheism. I don't think that most Christians or Jews, for that matter, for example, obviously Jesus as a historical figure in Islam is considered far more important. Jews would view Jesus as a teacher, and certainly not as the way, in fact, that Christians would view him. But I think that where you see this transition or a transformation that gives me a great deal of hope is when you get to the aftermath of the Second World War. The 20th century is the most violent century human beings have ever known. In the 20th century, more people died in warfare than died in all 5,000 years of recorded history before it combined. And we think we've come so far. Certainly technology has improved, but human nature unfortunately hasn't. But I think that when you get to the end of World War II, it served, especially for the largest of the Christian churches, the Catholic Church, it served as a wake-up call, and a wake-up call from the framework of seeing the dangers anti-Semitism, and this demonizing of the others. And I would hesitate in terms of referring to Christianity historically as anti-Semitic. I'd say it'd be more of a movement of anti-Judaism. There was an anger and jealousy that the Jews didn't convert to Christianity. This comes forth in a number of the Gospels, as well as the writings of Paul, et cetera, in the Christian New Testament. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the Catholic Church will start the Second Vatican Council. It runs from 1962 to 1965. And on October 28th, 1965, the church will put forth, the Catholic Church will put forth Nostra Aetate. And what it stresses in Nostra Aetate, translation of in our time, is it attempts to move forward, to move beyond, recognizing the past injustices that Catholicism had in fact perpetrated on Jews, the hostility that it had towards other religions. And it begins to recognize the commonality. How does Judaism tie in with Christianity? How does Islam tie in with Christianity, in particular Catholicism? And it's a recognition in Nostra Aetate of, yes, indeed, Islam has a great many ties to Christianity. And with the historic ties, what they make reference to is Jesus of Nazareth. They make reference as well to the Virgin Mary, and how this is also very, very prominent in Islam, and stresses that there is a great deal of commonality. What's imperative to understand is, just like from the perspective of Judaism, the religion is basically, it's a monotheistic faith that ends here with the Old Testament. Well, from the standpoint of Christianity, Christianity views itself as the finished product. So it embraces the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, but this is the New Testament's far more important. This is the new and improved. This is the finished product. So anything that comes after Christianity would be, no, that's unacceptable. And hence, in terms of Islam, yes, there can be better relations, but as far as Christianity be concerned, the final word would be Jesus of Nazareth.
Okay. No, very helpful. Thank you so much. I mean, I think providing an historical context to the whole relations and how it evolved over time was, I think, in my opinion, super valuable, because it kind of helps us to also detangle some of the personal relationships we have, or the feelings we have within this. I mean, as you know, with Peace Silence, we are really dedicating our time and effort and all of our resources to really building more consistent relationships. But you're 100% right, like especially with the Crusades and then the mentions and all of the when we come back to 21st century, a lot of the terrorism being being promoted under the name of Islam in that setup is also like creating all these different perspectives, right? Like, so to your point, so how could we, I mean, obviously none of us have as deep information as you have, right? So what would you suggest, how we can get some quick learnings about this and understand, and also what can we do to help, as a person, to us who don't have all the resources sometimes, to understand some of these contexts in a more broad perspective?
I would think that the dialogue is obviously very, very valuable, and has been tremendously helpful. And I would say that where it's most striking from a comparative religious perspective is in the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. And tremendous steps have been taken in terms of improving the relationship there. And I think it's also a case of Christian guilt, perhaps, because of a very, very tough background over the course of what's oftentimes referred to in Jewish Christian annals as the longest hatred. But what I see as the next frontier is improving the relationship between Judaism and Christianity and its sister faith of Islam. And the demonizing of the other, historically, we see this time and time again. We see this not just from a religious perspective over the course of history. We see it from a racial standpoint. The list is endless. The darker side, so to speak, of the human psyche, the human spirit. And so I think that with communication and improving steps, opening lines of communication in organizations such as yours are very, very helpful in terms of that, because by talking to each other, it's a tremendous aid in breaking down walls. And though I see a great deal in this nation of progress regarding the religious faiths of Judaism and Christianity, I don't see it as of yet with Islam. And it's something that is absolutely necessary. I hope in my lifetime I see great progress being made there. But there's some steps have been taken, but there's still a long, long way to go. So, I mean, there's different, I would recommend Karen Armstrong, who writes a great deal on this topic, as being an actually very good source. Her short history of Islam is very good, and more of a tie, because I would say that most Americans, I can remember a few years ago, there was a Baptist minister who was going to burn copies of the Quran. I guarantee you, I'd bet my life on it that he had no idea that of these historic figures from the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament are featured very prominently. No clue whatsoever. And it's this type of demonization of the other that needs to end. And if we can recognize the ties, we can go a long way towards, with dialogue, which I think is the first major step, towards improving matters significantly.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think it really speaks to some of the ignorance, right? Like, so demonizing happens also. You can easily demonize someone when you have no knowledge, right? So it's like to your point. I think connections, coordinations, dialogue events are important, but as important as also reading and expanding the knowledge, which occasionally sometimes harder. And I'm hoping like. As our discussions today is going to be on YouTube, people can go and watch it. But I think it becomes more critical to also gain some more knowledge than what we currently have, because it's easy, it's not that easy. So we have another question in the context of the history, I guess. How is God relevant to the faiths, right? Like, so are these really seeing more like the religions, or more like the belongings or the clubs that we connect, right? I'm sure within a religion you have many different types of people, but how do you see God in the sense of the common bond across the religions?
I think it's a sense that what I'd oftentimes say in the classroom over the years would be, in essence, if this whole concept of religious triumphalism or religious exceptionalism, I would say to my students, if I'm born in Saudi Arabia, I'm going to be a Muslim. It's that simple. That's the virtually no doubt in my mind, if I'm a religious person. If I'm born in Kansas, the plains of Kansas, I'm probably most likely going to be a Christian. And I'm probably going to be what form of Christianity? Probably a Protestant, more than likely, because Protestants are the majority of the American population. And if I'm in Israel, I could be a Muslim, most likely. I could be most dominantly, I would be Jewish. So it's this whole concept of where you're this religious elitism by the luck of birth. And I would say that in the vast majority of cases, the religion that we arrive with on planet Earth is also the one that we take on the way out of our, at the end of our earthly journey. So this concept of a supreme being, it's a case of how do we relate, how do we understand. And in Judaism, as I made reference to before, it's not as cut and dry, this whole focus on eternal life. And I would say in the whole concept of God, of a supreme being, Adonai, or the Christians refer to him from the standpoint of the Old Testament as Yahweh. This whole concept of God, it's far more comparable, the Jewish interpretation, as it would be with the Muslim interpretation of this one supreme being, one being only. With Christianity, the whole concept of the Trinity, of three gods in one, ends up being a bit more confusing. And in fairness, it was confusing for early Christians at first too, in terms of this perfect harmony of God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, which eventually is resolved, but not until the Council of Nicaea in 324. So there's different outlooks, different interpretations, different histories. With Christianity and Islam, this whole focus on eternal life, yes, that's pretty much cut and dried, guaranteed by this supreme being. In Judaism, it's a bit more of a question of we don't know exactly. I mean, hopefully, might be, but it's not as cut and dried as is with the other two faiths. But this demand for an ethical conduct through and through of service to others, of helping the less fortunate, these strains are something that are very, very good, and they run as the foundation through all three of these religious faiths. And that's something I think is very, very good. And I think that in the future, what you'll see is less and less of this whole concept of religious triumphalism, because it's really not necessary. I'm speaking as a historian, but as well as a Christian, as a Roman Catholic. But I see much more the commonality, and that's what I think needs to be embraced, as opposed to our differences.
No, that's a great point, and we have a couple other questions. So, one, I want to go to the pandemic, but just before, how the pandemic impacts the perspectives of Abrahamic traditions in general, basically during these times. But before I just go to that, I just want to highlight something that you mentioned, the common bonds, and I think that's kind of the human nature, right? Like, so we always, maybe it's the way that we're trained, maybe it's the way that we're here, we always understand black, because there's white, we understand beautiful because there's ugly, we understand there's good because there's bad. Like, so I think people are always inclined to go to the differences, and I think what you actually brought in a lot of the common themes and common bonds, and putting some of the similarities, which I think is super helpful. How can we help to ourselves also to kind of keep consistently stay in the common thread? Like, how did it work for you personally, right? Like, to keep staying in the common, is that the knowledge, is that the socialization, or is that like reading? Like, how we can also help ourselves in that to stay in that common thread?
In terms of the question being in terms of like recognizing the commonality.
Yes.
I can talk of my own personal experience briefly as a kid, being a Irish American kid, being raised in a Roman Catholic household, going to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school. I didn't know anybody who was Protestant, much less somebody who was Jewish or Muslim. And I would give a great deal of credit, actually, looking back to Catholic college, a Jesuit school, that I went to, because in essence, that's when we learned a great deal about the sister faith of Judaism. That's when we learned a great deal about Islam. And of course, this was all post-Vatican II. So it was much more, I'd say, enlightened compared to what things had been prior to the 1960s. And so that was very, very helpful as well. And it probably was more of a sense first of reaching out to the Jewish communities. I'm technically a Jewish historian. Most Jewish historians are Jewish, and so I'm the exception. For Jewish historians who, I would say my experience has been, who are not Jewish, overwhelmingly they tend to be Roman Catholic, and like myself. And I think a lot of that has to do, a lot of priests, a lot of nuns I've known over the years as well. I think it might be because we have the worst track record of all in the treatment of the Jews. We're in a league all our own, and it's obviously embarrassing, but it's reality nevertheless. But I think that once that step was taken, then it becomes easier as well, very easy, because, and what's really frustrating doing comparative religious history is that yes, people now understand for the most part the ties between Judaism and Christianity, but they don't with Islam. And I think that this is becoming more and more common, and that can only help matters. That can only help improve the relationship. Because what I've heard from Christian audiences over the years, this is Protestant audiences as well, Catholic audiences, on the same topic, in sometimes question and answer, sometimes I come up to the podium afterwards, would be very, very strange in terms of interpretations of the respective sister faiths. So I think that it's something that has transitioned, and initially I think people are more standoffish because we're comfortable in our lives that we're A, B, C, and D. We fit into this nice little box. I'm A, B, C, and D. Oh, you are too. That's great. Oh, you're A, B, R, and L. How did that happen? Okay, I'm not comfortable with that because that's out of my box. That's out of my zone. And I think that once these walls can in fact be formally removed, the progress that can be made would indeed be extraordinary, though it's going to take a great deal of time.
And effort. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Tim. So let's come to the pandemic question. Actually, I agree. There's a lot of crisis going on. I think now religions are, faiths, especially Abrahamic traditions. I mean, be that now the way that we connect becomes much different, right? All of our faith space as well. Like we always communal, right? You actually gather in churches, you gather in mosques, you gather in temples, and now like it's really all Zoom meetings. But part of it is also like I think everybody's recognition of not having control over anything, right? Like it's been a super like literally we were all on it together as a whole world. Like I don't know if you've lived something like that where we were in it all together as a whole world. So what do you think about that in terms of the perspectives of Abrahamic religions and how it's going to impact, you think?
That's an excellent question, and it's difficult in terms of what It's been such a strange year. My mother, she'll be 94 in August, and my father was a World War II veteran. He was in the European theater. He's now passed away. But I was saying to my mom a couple of weeks ago, I said, have you ever experienced anything like this? Having lived through the Second World War in your lifetime? And she's like, nothing even close to this. I mean, it almost seems to be incredibly surrealistic. And of course, from the standpoint of the United States, when it was first starting, it became political, and it's still becoming political, which is so bizarre to me. I don't understand that at all, that it was the blue states, it was the Northeast that was being hit. And now suddenly, it wasn't impacting the red states, the conservative states at all. Well, now it is. And suddenly the blue states are, and it's like how we look at this and how we view this, as opposed to it's hitting all of these nations, the United States in particular, with a tremendous force. And it's I would say, even more of a recognition or a realization of the need to work together, and that eternal truth that there is one race, the human race. And if people could see that and embrace that in the vast majority of cases, which unfortunately I don't think happens, I oftentimes say I could die a happy little historian then. But the pandemic is a tremendous equalizer. And it's just in many ways, because it doesn't know race, religion. It doesn't pick and choose as it goes through. It's kind of like a case of fate. I mean, obviously, you can take steps to protect yourself, but it's been a challenging time for this nation, for the world as well. And I think the challenges ahead are also going to be very long and difficult.
Yes. Thank you so much, Tim. We're hitting the top of the hour, so I don't think that we have any more questions. I think we've covered all of them, and we